Good morning, everybody. Thanks for coming to the Data Colada Seminar Series. It's my pleasure to welcome today's speaker, Jen Dannals, as well as her panelists, Em Reet, Dave Dunning, and Dan Filer. In addition to all those folks, Joe Simmons and Yuri Simonson will be here as well, and all of us will be here trying to ask questions, and while we're still listening to Jen Dannals, for all of you, you'll see at the bottom of your screen, you have the opportunity to submit questions through the Q&A function. Those go directly to all of the panelists, including both Jen, who won't have time to read them, but also Em, her co-author, who potentially will, and can respond either in text or any of us who can respond verbally as well. If we don't get to your question, it will still get to Jen. That is, everything is recorded, so she'll be able to read them anyway, so don't worry about that. And the last thing is you will see at the bottom of your screen, there's also a chat function. Don't use that. Use the Q&A function. It works better for all of this. I think those are all the things. Okay, so thanks everybody. Jen, the floor is yours.
Awesome. Just making sure everybody can see this. Thanks so much for having me. There's something kind of poetic about planning to give this talk right after the election and now getting to give it right after the inauguration. As Leif said, my name is Jennifer Dannals. I'm an assistant professor of strategy and management at the Tech School of Business. And today I'm going to be talking about a topic that motivates a lot of my research, which is how people come to their perceptions of social norms in groups and teams. So I'm going to start off with a broad statement that hopefully isn't too controversial, but because social norms are so interdisciplinary in nature, it's helpful to get everyone on the same page. So this broad idea is that our behavior is in part determined by what we perceive to be normative in a given situation. And I want to parse this for a moment just to get us all on the same page together. So when I say normative in this talk, I'm going to be specifically talking about descriptive social norms. So these I'll define as what most people do or what we happen to think the average person does in that situation. So we might rewrite this statement to read something more like this. Our behavior is in part determined by what we perceive to be the most common behavior in a situation, let's say. And when I say our behavior, I actually think it's worth digging into what this ends up meaning, because most research on social norms tends to focus on the notion that we learn social norms so to conform to them, right? That's our goal when understanding or receiving social norm information. But I actually think our response to social norm information can be much broader than that. So take, for example, imagine that you're the leader of a team and you're observing a team that has just a ton of conflict, right? Everyone's disagreeing a lot. You can't seem to get much done. You might say that this team has a high descriptive social norm of disagreement or conflict. Whatever you call that behavior, you're recognizing it's too far on one side of the spectrum. And so as the leader, you're thinking, all right, I'm going to work on conflict resolution. But if you happen to teach groups and teams dynamics like I do, you know that it's just as perilous for a team to fall into a pattern where there's no disagreement at all, right? Where people seem to censor any disagreement or conflict that they feel they're not comfortable bringing it to the surface. And so in this case, you might actually want to stimulate conflict, right? So these two teams are on two opposite sides of the same spectrum in some sense, and that spectrum is the social norm around disagreement. And so you as the leader are doing something that's actually in opposition to what you see the norm happens to be, but you're only able to take those actions because of how you perceive the social norm. So I really think that understanding how what we see as the average behavior in a situation is even broader than conformity. And so the research question that motivates me most generally is, how do individuals infer or perceive these descriptive social norms in groups? Today, if time allows, I'm going to talk about two different projects. In the first, I'm going to be thinking about who in a team, in particular what rank within a team, affects our perception of descriptive social norms the most. And in the second project, I'm going to zoom out even further and think about a whole network, so a whole community, and think about who within that network ends up having the best or most accurate perception of the social norm within that community. And just as a shout out, I'm going to thank my co-author teams on each of these projects, some of whom are on the panel today. All right, so let's dive into the first talk here, or the first paper here on the left. So who in a team ends up having who do we think has the best social norm information? And when I think about this project, it's helpful to have a sort of toy example of how we think about social norm perception playing out. So we have a central actor in this example, so someone who's trying to figure out what the norm is. They have a reference group of some kind. These are people who the situation has made relevant for whatever the behavior is. For the purpose of this paper, we'll just focus on the team that you're assigned to in an organization. And then you're coming up with some sense of a measure of central tendency. This could be the average, as I put here, but it doesn't end up mattering hugely for the question that we're going to ask, but you're trying to get a sense of what this is. In previous work, I've thought about, how the distribution of behavior within the reference group might influence this perception. But in this project, I want to instead consider how differences within that group might influence it. We know on some level intuitively that we don't weight all people's behavior equally when we're trying to figure out this central tendency. We might view some as better indicators than others. And so who are these people that we think are more representative of it? Who's most useful in this process? And in particular, I want to consider hierarchical rank. And I chose that for a variety of reasons. There's a rich psychological literature on the effects of hierarchical rank. But it's also because I think the literature up to this date sort of suggests that higher ranking people should be better sources of norm information. That's because high ranking people often set the norms within a group, right? So they establish these standards. And so I think people often suggest that means that they know them better or embody them better. They always draw more attention via their more approach-oriented actions. And so because of that, they might be particularly likely to populate our perceptions of what's common within a group. And work that integrates social identity theory with this notion of leadership within groups suggests that group leaders tend to be the prototypes of that group's social identity, that being prototypical helps them rise up into leadership positions. And so if that were the case, you might think, if you look at the leader, you'll get a sense of these sets of norms and schemas that embody the group in and of itself, and that would make them particularly representative. But my co-authors and I actually thought that there's a good argument for the opposite being true in this case. And that's because lower ranking people have to be naturally more bounded in their behavior. They have to be more in tune to their environment. And when you think about this, it starts to become more obvious that high ranking people can get away with a lot more things, but there's some unique feature of being lower ranked in a situation, which means that your psychology has to be more bounded by whatever rules are in place or whatever guidelines these norms are setting out. And so we sought to test these two kind of predictions across a series of experiments within this paper. Let me dive into the first one, unless there are any questions about the setup. All right, so in this study, we told participants who were online that we had done a lot of measurements of a bunch of startup teams in an incubator. We had measured a wide variety of workplace dynamics across these teams, and we wanted them to play a guessing game. It was going to be their job to guess these workplace dynamics that we had measured using the information we provided. And in order to control for the structure of these teams, we told everyone that all of the startups had the following structure. So there were 2 CEOs, 2 vice presidents, 2 product managers, equal numbers of people at each rank. And that's going to be important because we didn't want number to be something that would confound people's perception of how representative someone was, right? So we end up with this sort of strange hierarchy, perhaps, in which, we don't have a pyramidal shape or a triangle shape, but that's because we didn't want there to be a lot of low-ranking people, which would sort of tilt the scales in our favor of finding that low-ranking people were more indicative of the norm. So in order to advance, people had to be able to, understand this is the whole team. There are 6 people in the team. There are 2 at each of these ranks, so that we knew they understood. We then had people guess a variety of different behaviors. So they would see something like this. In the space below, please provide your best guess of the average number of times a team member from company E gives positive feedback to other team members in one day. And so they'd enter in the number, and then they'd learn some information. And here's where our manipulation showed up. They might learn that the CEO did this more often than the vice president, one of the CEOs and the vice presidents. Or they might learn the opposite, that the CEO did this less often than the vice president. And so they would then update their guess. Okay, now I think it's 3 times instead of 1 time. And we crossed who the comparisons were so that we had 6 total pairings. So all the possible pairings of CEO, VP, and project manager between behaviors. And when I say between behaviors, we had 10 total behaviors that these people were guessing about, and this was within subject. So each participant went through and would play this guessing game with a different behavior, a different pairing, fully crossed before they finished the study. So this gives us about a little over 3,000 estimates to try to answer this question of whose behavior they're using as more indicative of the average within the team. So to transform these estimates, we did the following. So I'll walk you through an example. Imagine here are the two pieces of information that you received on this number line, and here's the participant's final guess at this black dot. We calculated 2 scores per behavior per participant, and I'll call this final estimate distance. So essentially, it's just the absolute value of the difference between the participant's guess of the average, that black dot, and each of the 2 types of behavior. So with these lines representing that distance. And we took the absolute value because we didn't care whether this was on one side or the other of that behavior. And then we standardize this by dividing by the difference between those 2 types of between those 2 points of behavior, right? And so this lets us compare something that's on very different scales. So for example, comparing how quickly you respond to email, which is a number of minutes, to how often you disagree with each other, which is, a much smaller number. So we're going to compare these 2 numbers for each behavior for each participant to see which distance is. Originally, we were thinking smaller, right? So closer would be better, but it actually ends up being much more fluent for people if we reverse this. So our dependent variable is actually 1 minus final estimate distance. This means that higher values indicate greater weight of information from that rank. Okay, so I'm going to show you 10 graphs, 1 per behavior, though we analyze these in aggregate as a mixed model. And what you can see here is that we find a consistent pattern across behavior where the lower ranking behavior is given more weight in your perception of what you think most of people in the group are doing as compared to the higher rank behavior. So here we're collapsing across whether the lower ranking behavior is the project manager or the vice president, depending on the comparison set. But we can actually analyze that in addition to see whether people give even more proportionally more weight to the lowest rank of project manager than they do to vice president, and we find evidence in favor of that as well, right? So people are actually distinguishing not just between high rank versus relatively lower rank, but also between the 2 relatively lower ranked pairs. So this seemed suggestive evidence that individuals are viewing the behavior of lower ranking individuals as a better signal of the descriptive norm as compared to the behavior of higher ranked individuals. But oh, go ahead.
Jen, it's a small point, but I'm now realizing how consequential it was that you have a non-pyramid hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
So it means that no one is statistically distinctive. I'm just curious, basically, do your participants fully appreciate that or fully believe it? That is, it's very unusual for a company to have just as many CEOs as there are like lower level managers. Yeah,
no, that's totally fair. I think it's somewhat less unusual than you would think if you study startup teams. In particular, they often have multiple co-founders who are given equal rank at the top of the hierarchy and a pretty flat structure because no one wants to instantiate a hierarchy. But I take the point that I think intuitively people might be representing this as always a pyramid or always a triangle in some sense. The best evidence I have that they take some of this into account is that we did this study again, but manipulated the shape of the hierarchy that we showed. So we included a pyramid that had 1 CEO, 2 vice presidents, and 3 project managers, and one that was like this one, in addition to one that had no image at all. So just whatever people's priors were. And we find that though our effect holds across all of the conditions, it's much stronger in the case when we have the pyramid shape. So there's at least some of a difference between showing them a pyramid and showing them this hierarchy, this more ladder-like hierarchy, for lack of a better term, which suggests that at least they're trying to correct for it. It's an open question, I guess, whether they correct for it enough. Although at least within the social hierarchy literature, when we think about teams, we often think about ladder-shaped hierarchies because everyone perhaps has their own status rank, or everyone has their own job title, like that's more linear. But it's a fair question, I think.
thank you.
Yeah.
Hey, Jen, quick question.
Yeah.
So I noticed, and I have a feeling maybe you'll be doing other empirical stuff to address this, but I'd be kind of curious, even theoretically. I noticed, right, there are 3 ranks, and you compared top rank and middle rank. And so here we see lower rank, higher rank, but it's highest rank, middle rank. The theory seemed to really be about lower rank, higher rank, but how should we think about middle rank being particularly of note, I would say, potentially?
Yeah, no, that's interesting. So maybe I wasn't clear. So we compare all of the rank comparisons. So some people for some behaviors get CEO VP, some people for some behaviors get CEO PM, project manager, the lowest. Some people for some behaviors get VP and PM, right? So we have that fully crossed across behaviors. And so the secondary analysis I was trying to reference that I don't have visually represented here is to actually compare whether on behaviors where one participant got CEO VP and then a different behavior they got CEO PM, is the weight that they assign to the PM versus the VP actually different? Because the theory would suggest it should be, right? The lowest ranking person should be the most indicative of the social norm, and the middle ranking person proportionately less so, though still more so than the CEO. And so we do find that people are giving even more weight to the lowest rank relative to the middle rank, but more weight to the middle rank relative to the highest rank.
Wow.
If we add that in as an additional control.
Cool.
But yeah, no, good question. Okay. So far, I've only been talking about behavior, and I think it'd be totally fair to say, okay, maybe people think that high-ranking people still know the norm better, right? But they just don't necessarily act in accordance with it, right? So maybe the boss, if you were to ask him, would be able to report how often people work from home, but of course his own behavior, his own working from home behavior, is not indicative of that because he has other responsibilities. So in order to try to test this in our next studies, we looked at advice. So whose advice do you think would be most helpful in trying to learn the norm? And to do this, we ran a 2-phase study in the lab. And so in phase 1, we had 150 participants who signed up to complete an online pre-survey. They were told that they'd have to come in to the lab for phase 2, but before they did, they needed to answer some questions. And when they were doing that, they were told that when they came into the lab, they would be joining one of 2 teams of researchers as a research supervisor. So these teams, this might look a little familiar, although it's a bit smaller, have 2 research supervisors and 2 research assistants. And they said we told them that these research assistants and supervisors have been working to put together study materials for some professors, and they've been working together throughout the quarter. So then they were asked whose advice they would want to read to understand job roles and duties and of their new role as research supervisor and the culture and norms. Because there are 2 teams, they were going to end up having a choice of which team to join. And so this would help them make that choice when they arrived in the lab. So of course, this was, sort of a cover story. We didn't actually have these teams of research assistants that we needed them to join, but we wanted these people to really believe what we were telling them. So we pre-registered that we would only include people who actually signed up and then showed up in the lab, which, as we know, is always less than the people who say they will. So we had 87 people who showed up by our pre-registered stop date. Side note, I highly recommend having pre-registered stop dates because this one was right before COVID happened. Very auspicious. Okay, so we're going to analyze just the people who show up, but if we include everybody, it's actually a little bit stronger. So participants read, whose notes and advice from each of the 2 teams would you want to read in order to get a sense of the job obligation, role, and duties of your new position. And unsurprisingly here, 87% of them say they want to read the same role that they're going to be assigned to, which is the higher ranking of the 2 roles, the research supervisor. But when asked who they would want to read to get a sense of the team's overall culture and norms, excuse me, they overwhelmingly switched their preference. So even though they know they're going to be the research supervisor, and some were even a bit nervous about that prospect, they want to read the lower ranking person's advice about the overall culture and norms of this group. Okay, so this seems, suggestive evidence as well that people not only weight the behavior of lower ranking people more, but would prefer their advice when they are trying to get a sense of a group that they're joining. But so far, I haven't really dug into our explanation for why, right? For the mechanism that we think is at play. I talked earlier about how we think that there's a unique sense of psychology in lower rank that forces people to be more attentive to these kind of social norms demands. And so in our next study, we wanted to probe directly for that, as well as try to compare it against some alternative mechanisms that so far at least seem somewhat plausible. So in this study, we asked people online to imagine that they were joining a new job. They'd be part of the marketing team and they would be in the position of brand director. So here we have another ladder-shaped hierarchy, but with more ranks to try to test the robustness of this effect. So you'll see brand director is the second rank from the top. We again asked people their preferred advisor for job advice versus norm advice. And here we explicitly asked them about two potential positions. So the one that they would be occupying and one that was relatively at the bottom of the hierarchy or equally so at the bottom of the hierarchy. We've done this with a more rank order choice, but it made the analyses later much more of a nightmare. So we went with this for simplicity. And then we asked about 3 possible mechanisms. So for each of these, we developed a 4-item scale. I'll show you. So the first is our proposed mechanism, perceived attentiveness. All of these items explicitly compare high-ranking and low-ranking people within the item. So for example, people at the bottom of the hierarchy end up paying attention to day-to-day happenings the most. And so we had a couple more items probing at the same idea. We also measured perceived similarity because even though we were assigning people to be a relatively higher ranking role, we recognized that there are people online that might feel so uncomfortable or unusual to them that they just naturally assume that they're going to have more in common with the lowest rank or a relatively lower rank person. So this had items like, in this new team, I will have the most in common with people at the bottom of the hierarchy. And then we asked about perceived honesty. So people at the bottom of the hierarchy are more open than those at higher ranks about what's happening in the team. And this is because there's a sort of intuitive sense that's borne out in the social hierarchy literature that maybe people at the top of the team will be looking through rose-colored glasses, right? They wouldn't want to report about those sort of darker goings on within the team. And so, if you really need the true story, you need to talk to someone at the bottom of the hierarchy. And so far, we couldn't refute necessarily that that's the case. And so we wanted to pit these two against each other. So we replicated our prior effect that people prefer the same rank or the relatively higher rank for job advice, but when looking for social norm advice, look lower in the hierarchy on average. But to our sort of mechanism evidence. So here I've put up a number line. Remember, all of these items compare low ranking and higher ranking explicitly. So I'm going to show you the averages and then think about the interactions. So here are feelings of similarity, honesty, and attentiveness. So what this means is that people think that they are a little bit more similar to the low-ranking people than the high-ranking. That is in fact significantly different from the midpoint of 4. They think that low-ranking people are more honest than high-ranking people, and they think that they're more attentive than high-ranking people. But what we really care about is which of these lay perceptions, we'll say, is explaining the switch between job advice and norm advice, right? They might hold these beliefs generally, but which is it that ends up applying uniquely to how we perceive social norms? And so to look at that, we interact the type of advice that they're seeking with these scales. And when we look at it, we find that only attentiveness seems to be explaining this switch from who you prefer for job advice and norm advice. So you still believe that lower ranking people are more honest, for example, about what's happening in the team, but that's not the reason that the main reason, I'll say, that you're going towards talking to them for norm advice or reading their norm advice. It's more to do with this perceived attentiveness account.
Hey, Jen.
Yeah.
Super interesting. And I'm just curious if you have any thoughts on, there's an aspect of this, which is you have to be aware, you have to be self-aware of why you're doing this. And that can be difficult then, right? Because I think this seems like, I mean, you know better than me, but it seems like a type of dynamic that you might not actually know exactly why it is you're attending to certain people versus others.
Yeah.
Have you spent any time thinking about that, the self-awareness of these things and whether that matters here?
Yeah, no, absolutely. So when we were first thinking about a mechanism study, Em had the idea of just being like, let's go for, let's just ask people, like after they choose, they'll just write a bunch and we'll ask like 100 people and then we'll read it and we'll see what it is they're referencing. And of course, what people end up saying is just, I think they're the best, or like, I think they'd be the most useful. They're just repeating basically, which drove us kind of insane. So I think the idea here was more to try to get at, I think each of these are lay beliefs that are separate enough from social norms that people hold on to them, right? So if you ask people like, I don't know, who do you think is more honest, the high ranking person or the low ranking person on a team? I think people would be able to say how much they agree or disagree with that statement. I don't know whether they would themselves be able to say, yeah, that's why I asked them that one thing, or that's why I didn't trust them. But these beliefs are sort of measured separately as a result of it. So this is how we ended up sort of at attentiveness being measured with a scale that gets at like, how much do you think people pay attention to it? They might not be able to articulate directly, like I'm asking the person I think pays the most attention to social norms about it. But I think that helps us sort of get a little bit closer. We also then tried, are included in the paper, have a study that has a rather more heavy-handed moderation, where we basically tell people how attentive the high-ranking and the low-ranking person are to this, and show that we can basically reverse who you choose for norm advice. If we tell you that this high-ranking person is like, like lo and behold, they're the most attentive to these sorts of things. But I think that this is in some way more intuitive, because it's just getting at people's, the set of lay beliefs we have about what hierarchy means and how that is affecting your perception of who you want to talk to or whose information you want. But yeah.
Jen, can I ask a question from the chat? Cool. What do you think would have happened if we asked people who people thought had a greater role in setting norms as opposed to knowing norms?
I would think that they would probably rate that higher ranking people have a greater role in setting norms. I don't think that would explain who their switch from advice. Although, ideally we would find something that explained these 25% of people who always go against our pattern. That number varies, but we've always wondered what that would be. Maybe those are people who are thinking about, who's setting norms in particular, and that's most salient. But yeah, no, I think people would expect that to be the case. I mean, there's certainly a strong lay belief that leaders have a great role in influencing social norms in a bunch of ways. And so I assume that would carry it out. Good question.
Yeah, I actually have maybe two questions, at least one. The first maybe question is, I can't help but be reminded of your subjects replicating the work of Fred Fiedler from way, way back in the day, who looked at leadership styles. And you can imagine, okay, what's the leadership or a cultural style is something that is much like a quote unquote leadership style. That is the shop the leader sets. And what he found is the best measure of how a leader works in their team is how do they treat the least among their team, low-ranking people. So in some sense, what your subjects are doing is, I don't know if it's attentiveness, but it's rather accuracy. That is how the lowest ranking people are treated is the culture, if you will, or the best diagnostic of the culture. Fred Fiedler showed that in his work that spanned many, many years. And maybe there's a question in there. I'll let you decide upon that. The question I know is a question is that you're asking respondents about norms and culture. Those are very broad terms. As soon as you do scholarship in norms, you realize if you go to sociology, you see 17 wildly different definitions of what norms are. And so I was wondering to what extent you have a more specific sense of what respondents mean, or the breadth of what respondents mean when they're answering a question about culture and norms. What are they really talking about?
Yeah. No, that's a great question. It's definitely one of the most confusing terms in the literature, I'd say, at least personally. So we've varied how much additional definition we give to people when we ask these questions. So some of the studies I've shown you, keep it very broad so as to not suggest to them the correct definition. In some, we've used the behaviors that I showed you in the first study today to explicitly define when we say the team culture as these kind of more concrete behaviors, so that we knew that they would be more comparable across the two studies. So I think, within the world of, sociological definitions, I don't know whether they would be particularly satisfied with me calling this a culture, which I think is totally fair. I mean, and I also think that it's harder for them to think about, this sort of ephemeral, instantaneous norm learning, because they think of it as like a lifetime pursuit to gain some appreciation of a culture and its totems and all of those sorts of things. So yeah, no, I think that's interesting. I mean, your first point about leadership styles reminds me of, so far in this project and across all of our studies, we only think about what participants think in terms of who is the most accurate or who's the most representative. But there's a more obvious question perhaps, which is who actually is the most representative or the most accurate. And I think that previous work points to that. And then there's I think there's still a paper to be done about the whose perceptions, if we were to test them, are always the most accurate, which I think would be interesting. Okay, great. So across these studies, I've shown you some evidence that people prefer the advice of lower ranking group members when they're trying to understand this group's social norms. And that's especially because they think these lower ranking individuals are more attentive and they view their behavior as more representative, perhaps, of the descriptive social norm as compared to higher ranking others. But wait, this is usually the question that I would get at this point. Clearly, leaders matter. If anything, in the last 4 years has convinced us that, of course, we've been convinced that leadership matters in norm perception. And I definitely agree with that statement. Leaders clearly have greater powers of reward and punishment, which are critical in norm perception when they're chosen democratically, perhaps, though I don't yet have empirical evidence of this, but we probably weight their behavior more because we think it's more representative of everyone else. And they're likely in many situations more visible. So even if, for example, everyone weights their behavior less, they might populate more people's distributions within the broader network. And that means that they could end up being more influential, even if they're weighted less. So the goal of this first part of the talk has been more or less to add a nice asterisk to the statement to give you a sense of how bounded it is and make the case that lower ranking people in some cases have this unique ability to influence our perceptions. But in the second part of the talk, I want to zoom out a little bit more. So right now I've been talking about reference groups as this fixed set that's given to you by some organization for a greater purpose. But what were to happen if we think about how reference groups are naturally created within the network, right? If this reference group, instead of being assigned by an organization, were the people that you naturally end up friends with, how would that affect norm perception within these examples? And in particular, I'm going to think about what network position within the social network will have the best calibrated perceptions of the group's social norm. So why do I think this is an important question? Well, if we think about network positions, we often might, I'm going to argue that we should think about them in terms of your own outward looking perception, but we can also think about how that behavior influences everyone else. And we know from work on opinion leaders and thought leaders that people who are in these central positions, it's their behavior that might influence many, many others, much more so than their peripheral peers. So it comes to reason, like how well do they perceive what this network thinks? Is their behavior that's influenced by this norm perception, is that going to be something that is representative of the group that they're central in, or is that going to be less representative? How well are they perceiving it? And so that's the question I'm going to dig into in the talk today. And in particular, I'm going to talk about eigenvector centrality as our measure of centrality. So to the people not familiar with social networks, like I wasn't until this project, more or less, degree centrality is essentially the basic form of centrality. It weights all of your contacts equally. So, you have high degree centrality if you're connected to lots of people. So that's why, we have these little orange dots on the left side. Whereas eigenvector centrality weights your network connections by how central they themselves are. So this is sort of like, I would think, centrality on steroids, right? This is also the sort of measure that's used in Google's PageRank algorithm. It's saying how much information, how many contacts do your contacts have, and let that feed up proportionally. So we're going to think about eigenvector in particular here, although I think the pattern should be somewhat similar for degree centrality, albeit probably a little bit weaker. I'm going to skip this for time, but on the off chance that you're so interested, a guy named Connor Aspel has built social networks of all the Game of Thrones books, and he's done it both with degree centrality and also with eigenvector centrality, and then talked about the differences, which is, at least if you're a geek, kind of fascinating. But the reference is now a little bit dated, and I want to make sure I have time, so I'll go through it instead. Okay, so let's consider why central people might actually be less biased. And I think that this is the more intuitive of the two claims. Certainly, if you look at the literature, what you hear mostly is that central people are influential and that central people have lots of information, right? Network connections are pipes through which information travels, and that means that central people have access to perhaps the most information within that network. And so if what helps us perceive a social norm accurately in an unbiased way is having lots of social information from these people around us, then who better to perceive this than the people who have the most information? So to represent this, we might think something like this, eigenvector centrality, more total social information leads to less bias in your norm perception. But I'm going to argue that there's a reason why people actually might be more biased when they're in the center of a social network. And that's because of how social networks are sort of naturally emerge. We end up being more connected to people who are more similar than us. We think about that as homophily, this attraction between similar others. And we end up being more connected to people who have more naturally popular traits. So we think about that as an influence of popularity. And that means that we're going to be connected to an unusual set of people the more central we become, right? Central people themselves are unusual. They're attracting lots of, say, very sociable others or others who do activities that make you more sociable. And this means that central people have unusual networks, whereas peripheral people, right, they have homophily that might make them less representative, but popularity actually helps them become a little bit more connected than they would be otherwise. And this means that the network of peripheral others can actually be more representative when we think about traits like extroversion in the population, as Dan showed in this paper with Adam I'm citing, than central people are. And so the argument for this would be that as your centrality increases, you're going to have less representative social information in your connections, and that's actually going to lead you to have more bias in your norm perception. So we want to test these two sort of competing paths. And at the same time, we want to control for a sort of additional path that's already been shown in the literature, which I'll call less representative self-behavior. And this is the notion of false consensus or social projection, which is the idea that, essentially people are going to think that their own behavior is more representative of the average than it actually is in general. And so we want to control for that own behavior, which here I think, has a sort of dual relationship with eigenvector centrality. Right? So if you're doing something that makes you more central, that could increase it, and your centrality might influence you to do that behavior more, which would go the opposite direction. We're not interested in this pathway per se, but we want to see what happens when we statistically control for it. How accurately do people perceive social norms, essentially? Okay. So to test these hypotheses, we did a full network survey of a class of MBA students. This was pre-COVID, which will be immediately obvious when you see the question. So the network question was, consider the people whom you've spent your free time with since you've arrived at this university. Who are you going out and doing informal social activities with? So this is a network questionnaire. People get a roster of all of their classmates and can check off as many names as they like to indicate that they've been interacting with them. So from that, we build this very dense social network because most people in this MBA cohort are hanging out with each other. We then ask people to report about their own socializing activities. So how many of the last 7 days have you spent at least 2 hours socializing with classmates outside of the classroom or study groups? And how often have you attended an evening social event? So I'll call this hanging out and partying. We ask this about their own behaviors. And then we ask this about what they think the average person is doing. So on average, how many days do you think all of the first year students are doing these two behaviors? So I'll treat these as a sort of 2-item scale for the socializing behavior and the socializing norm. We'll average them together and say, that this number represents essentially how many of the last week they spent socializing. We chose the behavior of socializing, at least in part because it's a very important norm for MBA students, as any of us who teach them know, but also because we think it has a good argument for showing both homophily and popularity effects. And so it makes it a good first test.
And just to pause there, I definitely see those strengths for why you would choose socializing as a target, but socializing also directly affects the network structure intrinsically. It's socializing. Would the same thing happen if it was how often do you read the Financial Times or something like that, where it's also part of the MBA experience, but is intrinsically less social?
Yeah, no, great question. So I would say it would only happen for behaviors which show homophily characteristics and popularity characteristics. So you have to end up, so when you look at the network, two people who are similar on whatever the behavior is have to be more likely to be connected. And people who are very high, or I guess in some case very low on that behavior, need to be overrepresented in general in networks. And so you can think about, so socializing, I think, is maybe the most obvious example that comes to mind, but you could also do something like alcohol use, which I think would probably end up in both categories, or, I don't know, playing sports in high school, which would end up in both categories, right? People who play sports will be more likely to be friends with other people who play sports, and people who play sports are more likely to be in many people's social networks as compared to people who don't play sports. So as long as you have those two features, I would predict that you would find this effect, because it's going to rest on that misrepresentative set of social connections. Unless, if you don't have that misrepresentative set of social connections, then I wouldn't predict that you would necessarily see this effect. Who you're connected to, I think, would still end up influencing your perception of the norm, but you would end up being connected to a better or more accurate set of people. And that means that, you should have a more accurate perception of the norm, or rather, at least it wouldn't be connected to centrality in terms of the accuracy. Yeah, great question. Okay, so we use these measures to calculate the three measures that we're going to need for this study. So the first is the network truth in some sense. So how much do people actually socialize on average in this community? In case you're interested, that ends up being 3.31 times per week. But the two measures that we care about most are the bias and descriptive social norm perception. So this is your guess minus the network truth. How far off are you in some sense? And it's worth noting here as a shout out to, I think it's Sebastian Derry and Shai Davidai and Tom Gilovich, who have a paper that says that people, always think other people are socializing more than they are. Like that is totally borne out in our data. MBAs have terrible FOMO. They think everyone else is having more fun than they are. Okay, so our third measure here is going to be bias in social information. And this is going to be how well do your close network connections do in guessing that social norm information. So we take all the people who you're connected to within the network, and we average their guess of the social norm together, and then subtract the network truth from that. So I think an interesting point here is why we use the connections guesses rather than the connections behavior. We could, for example, take the average of how all of your network connections, how often they socialize, and use that as information. And I think that there's potentially even space for an entire paper on that question, because I think there's an argument to be made that connections perceptions of the social norm are actually a better measure of the social information they put out. So for example, you might know that you don't socialize as often as the average person does, but when you talk about what you do, you're going to be more likely to represent it in a way that puts you closer to that average. Or when you punish others for, violating the perceived social norm, you punish not based on your own behavior, but based on what you think the average behavior is. So this is how you can get pluralistic ignorance in groups, even though people's own behavior would be different. It's because of this sort of disconnect. So that's to say that we've run it with behavior, we find a similar pattern but weaker, and I think there's actually like an interesting theoretical reason why, which I'm happy to talk about more if we have time. Okay, so let's get into testing hypotheses. First, just to make it clear, we find a strong social projection effect. So people who socialize more think that others socialize more as well. We're going to control for that in our other analyses so that it can't be explaining the effect entirely. And let's now dig into this first pathway of centrality to your social connections. So essentially, are central people more likely to be exposed to non-representative social information? So on the x-axis here, I have centrality from 0 to 1. On the y-axis, I have your networks connections perceptions of the norm. I haven't subtracted out the actual average behavior because I think it makes it easier to see without setting it at 0. But that's the actual average here as a line. And what you can see here is that as centrality increases, you're more likely to be connected to unusual or misrepresentative others, right? We have a positive relationship, and that positive relationship is the bias in social information. And so testing that in a regression, we find support that, we have that first stage that central people are more likely to be connected to biased social information in others. So how does this relate to their norm perception? Do we have a second link here To test that, I'm going to put social information on the x-axis and the perceived descriptive norm on the y-axis. And again, both of these lines are indicating the actual average behavior within the group. And here you can see that as your social information becomes less representative, you also have a less accurate or a more biased perception of the descriptive social norm. This line is, some of the graphs have all of the controls in them, not all of them do, just for ease, but the effect remains robust. So this we'll call the bias in norm perception, and that sort of completes this link of how high centrality people can end up more biased in their perception of the social norm. But interestingly, what about the sort of third pathway that I talked about? If we control for these two potential biases, how well do central people end up doing in their perception, in their ability to perceive social norms? So here I'm showing just the direct effect that central people are more biased in their perception of the social norm, as reflected on the y-axis. But if I control for the other two pathways and graph that regression line instead, that's the orange line here, the dotted orange line. And what you can see is that centrality is actually making you less biased in your perception, right? So more information in some sense, if it's unbiased, if you control out for these other biases, can help you get a little bit more accurate in your perception of the descriptive social norm, which is represented here by that negative beta. Okay, so I've shown some evidence that central individuals are connected to others who have more biased perceptions of the social norm, and that this leads them to have more biased perceptions as well, even controlling for false consensus or social projection. But this is, of course, a cross-sectional study. There are issues here in terms of establishing causality, and so we're still exploring it with multiple stage surveys that we've been running, and also possibly with a simulation to try to get a tighter sense of the mechanisms that are at play. I also think there's an interesting question here of what this would look like with a randomly generated network. So if we created, a networked community online on an online platform, and we either let the network be generated with homophily and popularity or be generated entirely randomly, we would of course assume that, the randomly generated network would break those two features and would then lead to people who are in a central position only being more accurate via that third pathway because the other two are not in play as much. And Leif's question earlier, how would this look in norms that are governed less by things like extroversion that make you more or less connected? So I think it would also be interesting to sort of compare two norms within the same network, one that we know is related to homophily and popularity or exhibits homophily and popularity, and one that we know doesn't, to show that sort of differential comparison. So that's some of the ongoing ideas that we've been discussions that we're having. Okay, so I wanted to end with just sort of zooming out to a few research questions that I think are very open. I think a lot of people often think that because their social norms and social influence have such a long history within social psychology that all of the questions have been settled decades ago. And so this is my private pitch for more people to be interested in these same questions. So first, the obvious one: what influences our perception of the social norm, but also whose perception ends up being most accurate. So far, I've only talked about a few influences that could be at play here, but you might imagine, like, what about tenure within an organization or team? What about demographic similarity or differences within that organization? And what about personality traits? Are there different kinds of people who end up being more accurate or less accurate in perceiving these social norms? For what purposes do we seek social norm information? I made the case at the beginning that above and beyond influence, we're interested in social norm information, but that's more or less conjecture because it's not really something that's been empirically examined as much. And finally, what effect does does learning the social norm have on our behavior? Or perhaps more accurately put, when does learning the social norm really change our behavior, and when does it not change our behavior as much, right? We know that there are boomerang effects, but our ability to predict that has been, a little bit wanting within the world of nudges. So, how can we understand, how can we build a theory that helps us predict that better? So if you're interested in any of these, contact me. I'm looking forward to it. Thanks, everyone. Are there any more questions that would be useful in the last few minutes?
Yeah, I just have hopefully a quick question, which is that the social network studies are fascinating and can be exploited to take a look at other situations that may matter. And in particular, how people characterize the social norm. Appropriately, you've started out by looking at people's perceptions of the average of the social norm, but there's also the spread. There's also the possible. And so I'm intrigued by in the data that you just showed, if people were asked, okay, how much can people socialize? Okay, what's the most social people, how much are they socializing? Might things flip such that people who don't socialize as much really don't know how much socialization can be exploited, how much can be done? That is, you've shown people who really socialize don't understand how many people aren't. But there is a flip when you start asking questions about spread or about the possible, where people at the other end don't know what's possible in terms of what type of social life, at least some of their peers are experiencing. So I just throw that out.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. I mean, I thought about, trying to get measures of variance, or people's perceptions of variance rather, but that I find very difficult for people to give any sort of intuitive response for. But I like the idea of asking basically about, the lowest percentile, right? So like, who's at 10% and below on socializing, or what are those values? How many people socialize less than this amount? Because I think our understanding of the variability of a norm or the strength of a norm is also like a big open question. We know that more variance in behavior means probably a weaker norm in some sense, but beyond that, I don't think there's been a lot that's examined it directly. So
no, I think that's right.
Cool.
Oh, excuse me. And it's also the case that people's behavior is often constrained simply because they don't know what's possible.
Yeah.
Either in terms of degree or quality.
Totally. Yeah. No, and I mean, you could think about situations where the extreme in behavior is very salient because everyone's present, versus where the extremes of behavior are essentially invisible because you're never seeing it. Yeah. No, that would be very cool. Thanks, David. Other questions?
I had one kind of question, I guess. So it's interesting how right. So the second project is about we tend to think being really central gives you access to lots of information. It's like how plugged in are you into how the social world works, right? And like central almost definitionally means like you're super plugged in. And it made me think a little bit differently. I hadn't thought about these two projects side by side. So do leaders have really biased sources of information, right? I mean, I think the answer is often yes, right?
Yeah.
You have any thoughts about the connection between these two projects?
Yeah.
And is there something, does this now reflect differently on project one?
Yeah, no, that's super interesting. I mean, I originally tried to come up with some way of articulating that, some framework for putting the two talks together, because I do think about them as similar in some ways, in that they're both making a case for the underdog in some sense in norm perception, right? So either a lower ranking person or a peripheral person actually being unusually accurate or unusually wanted as a source of norm information. So no, I do think that there's some parallel there. And I think that, if you were to think about leaders, one of the reasons why, so if in the first project, we also had evidence that leaders were worse at perceiving social norms, for example, I would absolutely think part of it is an information story, right? So, but there, I think there might even be a case for a bigger case for motivated information misrepresentation, as opposed to, in the second project, I don't think any of these people are trying to misrepresent necessarily, that like central people aren't seeking out bad sources of information. It just sort of happens. But when we think about leaders, right, I think oftentimes the boss gets terrible information because people are going to not want to tell them, things they don't want to hear. And they're going to try to hide things that they're doing if that's not something that they think the boss wants. And you can have, I think, almost hilarious kind of miscommunications as a result of that. Or rather would be hilarious if it doesn't sometimes lead to bad outcomes. So yeah, no, I think that makes sense. I mean, I also think there's an argument here about, that normative influence flips some of the dynamics of social influence a little bit on its head, right? So to the extent that we've thought about hierarchies as sort of top-down influence in some way, the bottom-up influence is this kind of normative pressure, which I think is interesting. Yeah. Cool.
That was great, Jen. thanks so much. Really engaging presentation. And thanks again to all of our panelists for doing such a great job. And Em for relentlessly typing out answers as everything proceeded. And thanks again to our audience for joining us today. This is the start of a new semester for the Data Colada Seminar. We will be coming nearly every week, but I believe, unless something changed, not next week, but otherwise beyond that. So is that right, Joe?
Everyone who wants Leif to present next week should send him an email.
And Leif will ignore it, so it's fine. Thanks, everybody. Enjoy your weekend. We will see you all again soon.